know the expression, it never rains but it pours, don't we? Well, for flight crew, we can tell you that it most definitely applies to us. For those of you listening who have ever flown, have you ever had one of those days where one thing leads to another and then another, etc., and you finally arrive at your destination, perhaps days later, feeling like you've just had a starring role in a prank video? Well, if you're nodding your head and saying yes, I have one question for you. Why haven't you messaged us with the details of that flight yet? Seriously, we love a bad day on board story. And when this week's donor came to us with her experience on a recent flight, we knew it was right up our street. And this story brought up another, slightly more serious subject too. The one of the determined traveller. The passenger who gets on your flight knowing full well that they are probably playing health roulette. The person who knows that there is a slim or not so slim chance that getting in a pressurized tube and flying across the ocean in whatever condition they're in is probably not a good idea. But heck, they are, for whatever reasons they may have, going to do it anyway, brushing away any thought of the consequences or the impact that that slim chance might have on the plane, the other passengers and the crew when it becomes a reality. And today's determined traveller turned an already challenging flight for our donor and her crew into one that truly tested their skills and their patience. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the red eye! Welcome aboard the red eye. St Lucia to London Gatwick. The flight manager, Trevor, had been quiet throughout the whole hour-and-a-half bus ride to the airport. In fact, he'd been in a deep sleep at the back of the bus. Behind Alison, Daniel slept too, the pair of them clearly exhausted from the trauma of the night before, for very different reasons. Alison was tired too, her own sleep broken by the events, but this time was too precious to waste. She wanted to get her report written up and sent off before they reached the airport, so that she didn't need to give it a second thought on the night flight home, or, more importantly, after she'd landed. No, Alison hated nothing more than answering company emails on her days off, and she'd learned in her short time as purser that if she wrote down every single detail of every single thing that happened, there was a much reduced chance that she'd have to. She wondered what Trevor would write in his account of the night before, when he'd had to escort young Ben to the local hospital to have stitches in his leg. Would he write about what happened before? How he'd fallen over drunk on some rocks while skinny dipping at 3 a.m? Or would he leave some bits out? Thankfully, neither of the two managers had been there to witness it. They'd just been added to the group chat in the early hours, and Trevor, whose phone was unfathomably not on silent, had responded. So they were in the lucky position of just having to report the facts as they were given them. Boy fell on rocks. Boy needed stitches. No mention of nakedness. No mention of the all-day drinking extravaganza he'd been on, or the questionable local guy who had delivered him something outside. That was all just hearsay, and hearsay had no place on a formal report. Thankfully, because if it did, young Ben would be in a whole world of trouble, and Alison and Trevor would no doubt be dragged along to witness his demise. But, short and simple it was, Alison thought with a relieved sigh as she clicked on the button to submit her report just as they pulled up outside of the terminal. And that was the last thought she would give it. They filed down the steps on the coach onto the pavement. "Nice sleep?" she asked a red-eyed Trevor, wondering, not for the first time, if he was really rested enough to do the flight. He insisted that he was, though, and she hadn't pushed it because, well, quite frankly, if he wasn't, then there'd be another crew member down, and that was far from ideal. One down was just about manageable. 2 was a challenge. Trevor smiled and rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, I'm looking forward to my bed." Ben stopped. dressed casually in the resort wear he'd packed for his trip. Where should I go? Alison thought she caught a slight roll of Trevor's eye. Let's get you checked in, he said, leading him away to the desks to set him up with a business class seat for his flight home. She watched as the young lad walked without any shame and not even a limp behind him. Not a glimmer of guilt that he had let his crew down with his cavalier attitude, that they would have to work harder while he put his feet up. Not a spark of it. The passengers had, so far, boarded quickly and quietly. There was a sense of contentment in the cabin, Alison thought as she walked up the aisle. Everyone looked tanned and well-rested, fed for 2 weeks at their all-inclusive hotels and ready to go home and slip straight into their Christmas preparations. They seemed smiley and amicable, and that was always a good sign of the flight to come, a welcome contrast to the chaos of others. At the boarding door, Trevor was being handed the final paperwork by the ground agent, his brow tightening as he scanned down the manifest and special assistance notes. "Excuse me?" Someone called Alison to help them with stowing a bag, and she turned to assist, but not before she caught the look on Trevor's face. The look he was giving the yellow form he was reading, a mixture of horror and acceptance. "Oh no, not today," she heard him mutter as he walked away. "Not today." Whatever had troubled him was forgotten by the time they took off and the service was underway. The familiar routine of setting up carts and delivering drinks and meals, clearing in and offering tea and coffee, answering call bells and resetting screens, swept away the first 2 hours of the flight. Before she knew it, Trevor was in the back galley with 2 sick bags and a Sharpie, ready to flesh out some breaks. "Do you mind if I have a second? I've got a long drive home." Alison shook her head. "Oh, no, not at all. Have whichever you like." She could sleep on a washing line. She'd always been able to nap at the drop of a hat since she was a baby, and she also didn't have far to drive home. They were 3 hours into the 8-hour flight when she climbed backwards down the ladder stairs into the crew rest area of the Airbus A330neo and folded her body into the coffin-sized bunk. And she was an hour into the deepest sleep when she was dragged unceremoniously out of it. "Flight manager to R2, medical kit to R2. Alison stirred, unsure if she dreamt it at first, and then whoever was making the PA made it again. "Flight manager to R2, medical kit to R2. Alison jolted awake, her heart thudding hard against her chest. She had flown at the airline for near on 10 years. She'd been at another airline for 5 before that, and never had she heard the emergency medical PA made. The PA that told the crew that something serious was up, that someone was in a life or death situation. She threw back her duvet, fumbling with her blouse, sleepy fingers trying to do up the buttons, pulling on her skirt. She whipped back her curtain to see the rest of the crew filing sleepily up the ladder, ready to find what they would find and take things from there. In the galley, her crew huddled together. "What's happening?" Alison asked the 2 who had been on duty. "Apparently someone's having Braxton Hicks at the 2 doors, one of them answered. Alison frowned. They'd been pulled from their rest for someone's practice contractions. She shook her head as she tried to make sense of it in her sleepy head. She had never actually had a baby, but she was pretty sure that Braxton Hicks were not life or death, and she was equally assured that they didn't warrant an emergency call to arms or need the whole crew involved. She let out a sigh. "I suppose I'll go and see what the score is," she said, switching on her torch to navigate the dark aisle up to R2, shaking her head as she went. Trevor had his back to her as she reached the doors, and he jumped when she tapped him lightly on the shoulder, turning sideways to let her in once he saw it was her. She stepped into the space and looked down to the floor to where a lady lay on her back. her knees raised and her pregnant stomach sticking high into the air. She looked up at Alison and then, as if she were possessed, her eyes rolled into the back of her head and she let out an enormous roar. Startled, Alison jumped back. She'd never watched a real labour, and as such she knew that she was no expert, but if that was a fake contraction, then she certainly didn't want to know what a real one was like. She looked at Trevor, who was stood in some kind of helpless silence looking on. Where do you want me?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that told her he was out of his depth. Wordlessly, he swept his hand down to the floor. She followed it with her eyes, to the foot end of the lady, the end from which the baby would potentially be making its grand debut. "Oh," Alison replied simply. "Of course." Of course, her male manager wanted her to be at that end. Of course, the other crew, all young, inexperienced and predominantly gay men, hadn't rushed to position themselves there already. Nope, they had waited for Alison to come back from her bed. Collectively and silently elected her as the only female crew member of childbearing age to take the position at the helm and potentially deliver a baby at 37,000 feet. They probably hadn't even spoken about it either. They just all thought the same thing. Alison sighed, resigning herself to her new role as potential midwife, and knelt down on the floor. "Hi, I'm Alison," she said, trying for calm professionalism as she settled at the foot end. "What's your name?" The lady peered down at her over the rise of her stomach. "Bridget." Alison could see the beads of sweat running down her temples. "How far pregnant are you, Bridget?" 37 weeks, she managed, and then her eyes rolled back again. Alison grabbed her hand just as another contraction tore through her. Bridget's grip tightened with alarming strength. Alison shot a look at Phil, who was dutifully timing everything on his watch. Behind him, another young crew member stood poised with a notebook like he was observing a rare wildlife event. 37 weeks, Alison repeated under her breath. The cut-off to fly was 36. They all knew that. Phil nodded and pressed his lips into a thin line. 36 weeks plus 6 days, he said wryly. You couldn't make it up. The pain of her hand being crushed took Alison's mind off the ridiculousness of what she'd just been told. 36 weeks was 36 weeks, but someone had seen fit to round down by 6 whole days to make it fit for a holiday. Really? The contraction tailed off, and Bridget panted until her breath evened out. Are you travelling with anyone? Alison asked her gently. Bridget shook her head. My kids are at home with their dad in London. How many children do you have? Bridget's eyes were fixed on the ceiling above her, her face expressionless as she answered. 6. What followed was several hours of organised chaos. A frenzy of calls to Medlink, a nurse located somewhere on board who materialised like a gift from the heavens and immediately took charge of blood pressure and vital signs, and the rest of the crew rotating between offering Bridget comfort, water and sacrificial hands to crush during contractions. Up in the flight deck, the pilots plotted a diversion to Shannon, the first piece of land they could feasibly reach, but then ruled it out when they discovered the hospital was an hour from the airport. In the end, continuing to London made far more sense. Better to press on for a landing where proper medical care was on site rather than risk delivering a baby roadside in rural Ireland. And as they continued over the ocean, they all prayed the baby would wait until they got there. By the time the cabin lights flicked on for breakfast, the contractions were coming fast and furious. Meanwhile, blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant, the passengers began to stir, stretching and yawning and expecting to be fed, caffeinated and generally pampered. Alison walked through the business-class cabin with a fresh oxygen bottle balanced on her hip when young Ben, freshly unfolded from his fully flat bed and looking as though he'd slept through a spa weekend, raised his hand and smiled at her. "Can I get a cappuccino, please?" he asked, all polite innocence. Alison stopped mid-aisle. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Nothing. She looked pointedly at the oxygen bottle, hoping he'd connect the dots. Then at his neatly laid out granola and fresh fruit and crystal glass of orange juice. But no. He blinked at her, sweet and clueless, entirely missing the message that screamed across her face. "Ha, Ben darling, I am elbow deep in a mid-air childbirth situation. Read the room." "No," she said abruptly, deciding she should just stick to one word and not risk a torrent coming out. The sound of Bridget wailing just a few rows back pulling her away. And then the captain made his announcement to say that they would be descending, and she looked through the curtain into the chaos of the cabin. With 2 of them out of the service looking after the patient, and Ben living it up in 8A, the toll of being crewed down was clear to see. Bridget sagged as her latest contraction ended, and Alison gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be back in a sec," she said, dashing out to help clear in some trays, and then dashing back in again to hold her hand as the next contraction came. In and out she went, clearing and comforting until the cabin was as clear and secure as they could manage, and the seatbelt signs were flashing for landing. The nurse returned to her seat. The medical equipment was cleared away as best as they could, and a sweaty, exhausted Bridget lay like a tipped cow in front of Alison's jump seat. Trevor had appeared again, his face telling the story of 2 days of trouble, lines etched across it in the unforgiving morning light that was cutting through the window, his pallor grey and aged. What should we do for landing?" Alison asked, knowing that there was no way on Earth or in the air that they were going to be able to move Bridget. Trevor glanced down at Bridget, who was so utterly spent she was barely responding anymore, and picked up the phone at the opposite door. "Captain, I need permission to leave the patient in situ for landing." A pause as the captain answered, and a nod as he hung up the phone. He looked at Alison. "Get her comfortable and hold her as best as you can from your jump seat," he said wearily. They both knew that it wasn't ideal, but there was nothing else they could do. Alison sat alone at the R2 door, strapped into her jump seat, hands under her thighs, heart in her mouth. At her feet, Bridget seemed to be in and out of consciousness, the sweat still on her forehead, her lips pale. As the contractions came, it was as if she just didn't have the energy to scream anymore. Just whimpers of pain escaping, hands balled into loose fists. Alison was helpless, counting down until the wheels met the tarmac and the plane steered quickly off the runway. "Bridget, can you hear me?" she asked, quickly unfastening her harness and dropping back to the floor, shaking her shoulders. The poor woman opened her eyes and gave a weak nod. Before, awakened and re-energized from her brief checkout, she reached out her hand, grabbed Alison's, and squeezed it with alarming strength as a deep, guttural scream escaped her mouth from somewhere low down in her body. Alison tried hard not to scream herself as she felt her wedding band dig in hard to the bone of her middle finger, saying a silent prayer that the baby would stay in just a few more minutes. Just a few more minutes until the real medics arrived. Yes, the crew were trained. Yes, Alison could deal with a faint, a seizure, even a heart attack if she absolutely had to, but not one single member of this crew had ever actually birthed a baby, and quite frankly, she didn't want to. Not today. Not here. Not at 6 a.m. with 1 hour's sleep. The aircraft taxied at what felt like Formula One speed, and she braced herself as they swung around the final bend. This labour had been going on for nearly 4 hours, she realised, so surely it could do her the small courtesy of lasting just a few minutes more. They came to a halt, and she disarmed her door, eyes locked on the window opposite. For a moment, she saw nothing. And then, at last, the jet bridge began its glorious, incredibly slow crawl toward them. Relief washed over her so hard her whole body tingled from her head right down to her toes. Trevor cracked open the door, and there they were. Paramedics. 5 of them. 4 men and a woman, backpacks on, looking like a green-clothed band of superheroes. Alison stepped back as they took over and watched in interest as they took off the aircraft oxygen and replaced it with something they called Entonox, the gas and air Bridget had been begging for since the first contraction. The gas and air Alison would have happily taken a drag of herself at this point. As the paramedics unloaded bags and scattered equipment across the floor, the passengers filed out via the opposite aisle, steering around the scene with that British combination of intense curiosity and forced politeness. Bridget drew hungry breaths on the gas and air, and suddenly, pushing herself up on her elbows, her smile spread across her face and her hand raised in the air. "I'm ready!" she announced, startling them all. "Oh no!" The paramedic held out her palm. "Bridget, don't push. Not yet, honey. We need to get you to hospital." Trevor and Alison stood at the bus stop in silent camaraderie, the kind that only came out after surviving something intense together. Both were utterly drained, emotionally wrung out, and frankly, just done. It felt oddly comforting to just stand there, breathing, existing in the cold air, letting the last 4 hours slowly drip out of their systems. Bridget had made it off the aircraft with her baby still stubbornly unborn, a fact that, in airline operation terms, counted as a triumph. No diversion, no onboard delivery, no paperwork thicker than the aircraft manual. A win, technically. And yet, Alison couldn't shake the faint flutter of disappointment sitting somewhere between her ribs. A curiosity that tingled despite everything. What was happening now? Was it a boy or a girl? Would the baby have that adorable button nose she imagined? Those perfect little bow lips? That weird-shaped head? Would it cry the moment it arrived? If she had delivered it, would she have got a little cuddle? Now that the crisis was over and the adrenaline had drained out through the soles of her shoes, Alison found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, it might have been something beautiful to witness. A birth. Right there at 38,000 feet. In all its chaotic, primal, miraculous glory. As long as everything went okay, of course. And that was the big if. Because here's the truth of it. The truth behind every medical situation that we deal with. We crew treat what we see. We'll do everything in our power for our passengers when they become our patients. Compressions, oxygen, IVs, defibs, improvised triage in the galley. We'll hold your hand and wipe your brow and mop up your sick, calm your partner, comfort your children. But a plane is not a hospital. It never has been and it never will be. For all our equipment, all our training, all our determination, we cannot guarantee a good outcome at 38,000 feet. Not for births, not for heart attacks, not for anything. So, for any future determined travellers listening to this podcast right now, please, please bear this in mind before you make that decision. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is important enough to risk your health for, or a tiny baby's. So don't take that flight if you're not sure you're fit for it. Don't push it. Don't gamble with the sky, or indeed, your life. The Red Eye Podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye Podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.